The Central Intelligence Agency is known for many things, but in the context of Michael Bay's Transformers pentology, they're known for one despicable act. Their covert crusade to hunt down and destroy all Transformers on Earth, regardless of faction. You see, the catalyst for this crusade was the Battle of Chicago, which took the lives of over 1,300 people. This battle served as a crucial turning point for how humanity viewed the Autobots. Though they ended up saving the day, many felt that the bots were responsible for the attack, and believed that the world would be a safer place with them completely gone. Despite this public sentiment, the White House would grant sanctuary to the Autobots after the battle. However, this decision did not sit right with one specific man, who saw all Cybertronians as a danger to his country and planet. That man was CIA agent Harold Attinger, and he made it his mission to bring the age of the Transformers to a close, so he could prevent another alien war from happening again. In order to combat the alien menace, he founded Cemetery Wind, a CIA Black Ops unit created for the sole purpose of hunting down and destroying all Transformers. He also formed an alliance with the non-aligned bounty hunter Lockdown to help him in his quest. Despite appearing as a potential savior to humanity, a portion of Attinger's crusade is motivated by personal gain. You see, he seeks to secure enough money for a healthy nest egg to retire with, and to do this he agreed to a three-way deal between himself, Lockdown, and the founder of KSI, Joshua Joyce, that would provide him with 5 million shares in the soon-to-be thriving KSI, allowing him to retire from the CIA. Attinger also deeply desires recognition for the things he's done, but is pragmatic enough to understand that it's best to keep quiet, given that his operations are conducted behind the back of, you know, the President of the United States. Now, even though we know that Attinger was behind all this, how he was able to pull it off is still a mystery to us, since we don't know how Attinger established contact with Lockdown, ran his illegal operation without the government finding out about it, and by far the greatest mystery of all is exactly how Cemetery Wind was able to ambush Optimus Prime in Mexico City. And well, this episode of Fixing Transformers is going to answer all that and more. I know that today's video has been highly anticipated by you guys for several years now, and I'm positive that it will not disappoint. I mean, just take a look at the runtime. But before I go on to answer the Bayverse's most profound mystery, I want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, TEMU. Now, if you haven't had the pleasure of discovering TEMU yet, allow me to fill you in. TEMU is your one-stop shop for all things fun, fabulous, and most importantly of all, affordable. On their website and app, you can uncover an incredible array of high-quality products. From beauty to home decor to electronics, they have it all. But by far the most important category of all has to be Transformers. And thanks to TEMU, I was able to pick some awesome Transformers merch and share it with you all. First up would be YOLO Park's Optimus Prime and Bumblebee model kits. And these little guys are just incredible. They were super fun to put together and to play around with. You can get them into some pretty dynamic poses and they're pretty accurate to their CGI models. Next up would be this guy, who is essentially a G1 Shattered Glass bug bite. And this guy was a must-buy for me because I actually don't have any old school Generation 1 figures. I debated opening him, but the box just looks so cool. It would have been a crime for me to take him out. Lastly, I got some Transformer car accessories to pimp my ride. And you might be wondering, Theory Miss, how is a Decepticon necklace an accessory for your car? And well, I can hang it right on my rear view mirror. And as you can see, it looks pretty cool. Now, if you're wondering what these doohickeys are, these are Decepticon welcome lights. You stick them on the inside of your car doors, and when you open it up, a Decepticon logo is staring right back at you. So if any of this interests you, be sure to check out TEMU, and you can download their app using the link in the description below. Currently, they're having a site-wide sale with savings up to 90% off. They offer free shipping, and what's even better is that you have up to 90 days to return your items if needed. That's hassle-free shopping at its finest. But wait, there's more. TEMU provides a $5 credit if your delivery is ever late, and their price protection policy is a game changer. If you order something and the price drops within 30 days, you can request a partial refund. That's their commitment to making sure you always get the best deal. Speaking of deals, TEMU is offering all of you guys an additional 30% off. All you gotta do is download the app and type in my code DKM9224 in order to claim it. And with that said, I want to give a huge thank you to TEMU for sponsoring this video.
It's not their planet, never was. Time to take it back.
Alright, so in order to figure out how Attinger pulled all this off, we need to piece together what went down between Transformers Dark of the Moon and Age of Extinction. However, it's worth noting that there's a significant gap in our knowledge about this period. Unlike the previous Transformers films, where we had access to several prequel comics and novels, Age of Extinction unfortunately didn't get any. And it's all Amazon's fault. You see, when Transformers Dark of the Moon was in production, it would get a movie adaptation comic, which was basically a retelling of the film in comic form. However, on May 4th, 2011, 21 days before the official release date for this adaptation, and nearly 2 months before the film was set to release in theaters, Amazon added preview pages to its pre-order listing for the adaptation. Through some bizarre system error, if you clicked the cover or the search inside this book button, several dozen pages were made available, which included the major plot twist of Sentinel Prime's betrayal that the entire film hinged on. This leak caused the ending of Dark of the Moon to be changed drastically at the last minute. And in order to prevent a similar incident from happening again, director Michael Bay would go on to enforce an executive order during the production of Age of Extinction, forbidding the creation of any prequel or adaptation for the upcoming film. This is why we don't have the full story. And out of all the films that needed prequel content, Age of Extinction is probably the one that needed it the most, especially with it serving as a soft reboot for the franchise. However, not all hope is lost, since despite us not having a prequel that we can use to fill in the gaps, Age of Extinction provides us with several valuable nuggets of information that directly build off of what went down in Dark of the Moon. And even Transformers The Last Night of All Things has information that helps us fill in some of the gaps as well. So with that said, I'm going to use every single piece of relevant information from Dark of the Moon, Age of Extinction, and The Last Night in order to build a rough timeline of events between Dark of the Moon and Age of Extinction, so we can understand how Attinger was able to pull off his diabolical plan, and to figure out how many Autobots were able to survive it. And well, any good timeline starts with a beginning and end date, so let's get acquainted with those. Since we're picking right off where Dark of the Moon ended, one would assume that we would start our timeline off in 2011, which was the year that the film came out, since the two previous films were set during the year that they were released. However, Dark of the Moon and every subsequent film after this would break this trend, since Dark of the Moon is actually set in 2013, and we know this since in 2009 Sam just started his 4-year degree in geopolitics. This would mean that he would graduate from Princeton in 2013 during the last week of May. Additionally, we know that Sam has been job hunting for 3 months, based on a line from Ron Witwicky. So logically, Dark of the Moon takes place around September 2013. As for Age of Extinction, we know that the film is set in 2018, since Harold Attinger tells us that it's been 5 years since the Battle of Chicago. We also know that the film is set during the month of May, since Tessa Yeager only has 2 weeks of high school left, thus making Age of Extinction take place during May 2018. With that said, this means that I have around a 4-year and 8-month window of time to work with. So without further ado, based on all the information I was able to gather, this is likely what happened as soon as Dark of the Moon ended. Right after the day was saved by the Autobots, we know that the government would go on to grant them sanctuary on Earth, based on a line that Attinger says. Now you might be wondering, wait, didn't the Autobots already have asylum on Earth? And well, they did, but it got taken away. You see, when the Non-Biological Extraterrestrial Species Treaty, better known as NEST, was formed, a piece of legislation called the Alien Autobot Cooperation Act was crafted and passed in secret, in order to keep the public unaware of the government's partnership with autonomous robotic organisms from the planet Cybertron. This agreement was made between the United States and the Autobots, in which the Autobots would provide intelligence and protection from the Decepticons in exchange for a safe haven on Earth. Now, during the events of Dark of the Moon, Sentinel Prime would open a space bridge to the moon, which allowed hundreds of Decepticons to come to Earth, and ultimately ravage DC. After the attack, Sentinel Prime proceeded to send a message to the United Nations, claiming that he and the Decepticons would harmlessly take the resources that they needed from Earth, and depart with no further bloodshed if Optimus Prime and his Autobot rebels were exiled from the planet. And as we know, Congress swiftly passed legislation to exile the Autobots from American shores, thus putting an end to the Alien Autobot Cooperation Act, forcing all joint operations between the military and the Autobots to be decommissioned. Now, interestingly enough, the government would not reinstate the act after the battle, and instead only gave the bots sanctuary. This decision is particularly strange, since in Age of Extinction we learn that fewer than a dozen Decepticons were still on the run, and during the events of Revenge of the Fallen, we know that the United States government went on to declare war against the Decepticons after they destroyed the USS Theodore Roosevelt. And as we know, this war between the US and the cons was still going on during the events of Age of Extinction, since Attinger tells the Chief of Staff that the war with the Decepticons will be over soon.
These are the only fun meetings.
Look, I'm not here to entertain the president, but you may tell him that the war will be over. Soon.
So then, why would the government not reinstate all joint operations between the military and the Autobots, especially after realizing that they were not capable of fighting off the Decepticons without their help? And well, the general public is largely to blame. You see, the public had it rough when it came to learning that giant alien robots from outer space were living among them, and that some were working directly with the United States military. You would assume that the presence of robotic aliens on Earth would have been exposed to the world after the events that went down in LA, considering that there were hundreds of witnesses who observed the Cybertronians battling it out. And we cannot forget those who were driving in and out of LA who witnessed Optimus Prime and Bone Crusher fighting to the death. And well, in an effort to cover up what happened, President George W. Bush ordered the directive to discreetly dispose of the remains of the fallen Decepticons in the depths of the Laurentian Abyss, as well as ordering the termination of Sector 7, which was a secret government agency that sole purpose was to deal with extraterrestrial technology and threats related to the Transformers. However, something that also aided the government in covering up the event was the worldwide blackout that was going on during the battle. You see, early on in the film, the Decepticon frenzy infiltrated Air Force One, and while hacking into the military database to get information on Megatron's location, he uploaded a Spider-Bot virus into the system, which would later go on to cause a global communications blackout that affected all satellite and landline communications. This in turn would make it impossible for anything to be reported live during the battle. However, the government still had the issue of photographs and videos being taken that could expose the truth, as well as all the property damage, lives lost, and of course the hundreds of eyewitness reports who saw the Cybertronians firsthand. Knowing that the public demanded answers, the government created the Wyatt Commission to investigate the cause of the widespread destruction in the city. They eventually concluded that total responsibility should be placed on a defense contractor that they fabricated called McLaren Robotics. The commission testified before Congress, and Congress would go on to question the CEO of McLaren Robotics. The CEO testified that their remote-operated unmanned vehicles from their Automated Defense Initiative program, developed for rescue and evacuation purposes, wandered off their test site and into Los Angeles when the global communications blackout knocked their GPSs offline, causing them to malfunction and fight each other. The commission concluded that total responsibility should be placed on McLaren Robotics, and that any wild theories involving giant alien robots or the like were merely media conspiracy theories. This verdict was testified and thus served as the quote-unquote official answer as to what happened in Los Angeles. Now, on a side note, I do want to stress that this whole government commission cover-up was a plot point that we were supposed to see in Revenge of the Fallen. However, it was cut since the writers felt that the government covering up the events of LA came across in this scene where Sam is talking to Leo and his roommates.
The events of the fact that there are sentient alien robots on Earth is essentially kept secret thanks to the blackout of the news and nothing was working. We originally, in fact, I think in this had scenes of a cover story that had been put out by the congressional hearing of how some robotics program had gone crazy, but I think we got it across just with Leo and the gang.
Well,
just
we had written
saying,
a scene, remember?
Yeah.
There was a whole scene.
Now, though this congressional hearing never made it into the final film, we do know that it still happened in-universe, since Sharsky mentions that a cover-up happened,
just like the alien robots in LA 2 years ago that everyone covered up.
And in the Transformers Revenge of the Fallen prequel comic Alliance, after Nest hunted down and destroyed some Decepticon infiltrators that were looking for Megatron's body, Nest cleanup crew showed up in McLaren Robotics trucks, noting that if anyone saw the Transformers, they would use the usual story. However, no matter how hard the government would try to keep the Transformers a secret, a handful of individuals would make it their life's work to expose the truth that alien robots were living among them. Now, you might be wondering why part of the public believed that these robots that they saw were not merely just robots, but rather alien robots. And well, as we know, before the battle, the Autobots crash landed in Los Angeles, and while Optimus Prime landed in a deserted field, The other Autobots, on the other hand, drew a lot of attention to themselves. Ironhide crashed into some rich guy's pool, Jazz crashed through a baseball stadium, and Ratchet crashed into a street and bounced into a storefront. As you can tell, this caused a lot of commotion, and many people were quick to investigate what happened. Local LA news channels weren't far behind, and when gathering testimonies, these channels all heard the same thing. That being that there were several sonic booms before meteors crash landed and wrecked the place. Now, to our knowledge, this media story never got a conclusion, since whatever caused the destruction was now clearly gone, leading some to believe that it was alien in nature. And since the Battle of Los Angeles happened the day after this, it's no wonder why the conspiracy theory of robotic aliens gained traction among the public, explaining why the Wyatt Commission specifically denounced it. Nevertheless, despite the government's several attempts to keep the Cybertronians a secret, the events that played out during Revenge of the Fallen exposed the truth in a devastating way when Megatron decided that it was time for the Decepticons to end their secret war with the Autobots and reveal themselves to the world. In a show of force, the Decepticons destroyed part of France and obliterated the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Shortly thereafter, thanks to Megatron and Soundwave, the Fallen tapped into Earth's communication network, making a worldwide broadcast. The Fallen exposed the truth that Cybertronians had been living among humans for some time, contrary to what world leaders had claimed. He warned that unless Sam Witwicky was handed over to them, the destruction witnessed would continue until the world as they knew it was completely destroyed. And this was basically how the majority of the world learned that giant alien robots from outer space were in fact living among them. Unfortunately, Revenge of the Fallen doesn't really tell us how the public reacted to this information, outside of the fear and panic that they displayed during the attacks. But we do know that the media would report to the public that over 7,000 lives were lost, with the majority being American. Additionally, it became widely known that the United States military had elevated its alert status to Condition Delta, marking the highest level it has been at since the tragic events of September 11th. And that President Obama was flown to a secure bunker somewhere in the middle of the country. Furthermore, it would also be reported that the FBI, CIA, and Interpol were seeking the cooperation of worldwide law enforcement in order to interrogate Sam Witwicky about the recent attacks. So, as you can imagine, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty among the public. Dark of the Moon would build upon how the public felt by telling us that polls conducted showed that half the world would feel safer with the Autobots completely gone, and that many described the Autobots as a group of extraterrestrial mercenaries. And it probably did not make things better when the government implemented energon detectors and long-range defense systems in order to guard its cities. As you can tell, a good chunk of the public was not fond of the Autobots, and some would go on to protest them being on Earth by graffitiing random objects with a crossed-out Autobot logo that had the words "Go Home" below it. And when it came out that Optimus Prime told the government to trust Sentinel Prime, who as we know went on to work with the Decepticon leader Megatron to destroy Chicago, public sentiment for the bots hit rock bottom, and the disaster would go on to be treated by the public in the same caliber as the 9/11 terror attack. So with all that said, reinstating any joint operation between the military and the Autobots would be highly contested by the public, explaining why the government chose not to do it. As for why the government granted sanctuary to the Autobots, this can be easily chalked up to the government wanting to thank them for saving the day once again. Now, though the Battle of Chicago was finally over, the war with the Decepticons was still raging on, since there were tons of Decepticons all over the globe that went into hiding. And so, the United States government was in a bit of a pickle. They knew that they needed to end this war with the Decepticons, but the only way they could do it was with the Autobots' help. However, since the public wouldn't support the military working with the Autobots, they needed to find another way. And here is where Harold Attinger comes into play. Though we don't know the specifics on how Attinger went about founding Cemetery Wind, we do know that the government knows that Attinger and the CIA are responsible for hunting down the remaining Decepticons based on this scene here.
The president has asked me to ask you to ask him to invite you both over to the White House, just a powwow where we get maybe some more specifics about how exactly you're hunting the enemy Decepticons left.
With this in mind, I theorized that Attinger was able to see the dire situation that the government faced, realizing that if he could persuade them to entrust the CIA with handling the Decepticon threat, he would be able to gain sole power over the war, and would be able to eliminate every single Cybertronian from the face of the Earth. As for why the government placed their trust in him, this can easily be explained by the fact that during the events of Dark of the Moon, Attinger was a highly influential figure within the CIA, boasting 2 decades of dedicated service to the agency. And so, with the CIA given the approval to hunt down the Decepticons on behalf of the United States, Attinger went on to found Cemetery Wind. And here is where he would put together his Black Ops team. As we know, Attinger's goal was to hunt down all Transformers regardless of faction, and so he would need to employ operators that felt the same way as him if he wanted to see his plan through fruition. And luckily for him, this task wouldn't be that hard, since after the Battle of Chicago, the majority of the public turned against the Autobots, and when Attinger came across James Salvoy, he knew that he would be the perfect field commander for the unit. You see, much is unknown about Salvoy prior to the events of Age of Extinction. However, we do know that he likely had some sort of military training prior to joining Cemetery Wind. But the main thing that we know about him is that he lost his sister in the Battle of Chicago. This caused him to grow a deep hatred for all Cybertronians, and like many Americans felt that Optimus Prime was directly responsible for all the lives lost that day.
And I don't know what truck you're talking about.
Kind of cost American lives.
As for the other Cemetery Wind personnel, we unfortunately don't get any background information on them. However, it's a safe bet to say that Attinger only picked people who had a vendetta against the Autobots, specifically people with military training. And something that's very interesting is that 2 former Nest soldiers would join Cemetery Wind, those soldiers being Hooch and Mark-L. Now, this could always be just a case of the same actor playing another character. A prime example would be Glenn Morshower playing Colonel Sharp and General Morshower, or Stanley Tucci playing Joshua Joyce and Merlin. However, in these instances, we know enough about each character to know that they are not the same. We know that Colonel Sharp did not become General Morshower because he was killed by Blackout in the Soxent base attack, and there was just no way Merlin could logically even be Joshua. However, unlike these characters, when it comes to Hooch and Mark-L, we really know nothing about them, besides the fact that they both left Nest for some unknown reason after the events of Revenge of the Fallen. And during the events of Dark of the Moon, they joined forces with Epps when he revealed his plan to assist Sam in rescuing his girlfriend Carly Spencer and turning in the Decepticon liaison Dylan Gold to the authorities. Now, given our limited knowledge on these characters, it's entirely plausible that in-universe, Hooch and Mark-L came to the conclusion that humanity would be safer if all Cybertronians were gone. This belief was likely influenced by their first-hand experiences witnessing the devastating consequences of the Cybertronian War up close and personal on 2 separate occasions. This view on the Transformers alone with their military background would make them suitable assets for Attinger's cause. However, with their existing knowledge on how to combat Cybertronians made them even more valuable. With their expertise, they could train other team members in the art of effectively engaging Cybertronians, enhancing Cemetery Wind's ability to effectively take down the Transformers. Furthermore, during the events of Age of Extinction, we see that Hooch appears to be one of the higher-ranking soldiers in Cemetery Wind, likely because of his previous expertise. Now, since we're on the topic of Cemetery Wind's personnel, one thing I would like to address is if Epps and Lennox ended up joining the unit, since this was a question I have been asked a handful of times in the past, and well, I can confidently say no. We know that Epps didn't join the unit because during the events of Dark of the Moon, we learned that he retired from the Air Force, and by extension Nest, since he was tired of all the combat and aliens shooting at him. He only came out of retirement to help Sam save Carly and to lock up Dylan Gold. But then again, he wasn't working for Nest and was just the leader of his own team. However, if we put all that characterization aside, and let's say he did want to go back into combat, Attinger would never let him into the unit, due to his loyalty to the Autobots, and of course being the right-hand man of the founder of Nest. As for Lennox, thanks to the last night, we know that he didn't join Cemetery Wind after Nest was disbanded, since he went back to working for the United States Army Rangers, which was the unit that he served under before forming Nest. This would mean that the only way for Attinger to realistically be able to recruit him is if Lennox left the army. But with him having the rank of colonel at this point, there was no way that he would leave that position for a Black Ops job. Furthermore, Attinger would never recruit him into the unit, because just like Epps, he was loyal to the Autobots, and as we know, he was the guy who literally founded Nest. So now, with all the personnel squared off, you might be thinking that this is the part of the video where I say that Attinger then started to use his CIA Death Squad to start picking off the Autobots one by one. But it's actually way more sinister than that. You see, Cemetery Wind did not start off hunting down the Autobots. Instead, they worked side by side with them to take out many Decepticons before ultimately betraying the Autobots by ambushing Optimus Prime in Mexico City. Now, I know, this is a very bold claim to make, but I have 3 key pieces of evidence that can back this theory up, and I'll save the most convincing for last. The first piece of evidence that I have that supports the Autobots working with Cemetery Wind at some point is the fact that when Attinger got control of the war, he was dealing with the Obama administration. Now, you might be wondering, how is this a piece of evidence? And well, during the events of Revenge of the Fallen, the Obama administration viewed the Autobots as a potential threat to national security, because they believed that the reason why the Decepticons continued to stay and come to Earth was to seek vengeance upon the Autobots. This led them to actively discuss if their national security would be best served by denying the Autobots further asylum on Earth. Furthermore, the White House was in active contact with Nest to understand everything that was going on at a moment's notice. And keep in mind that this level of monitoring was present before the Decepticons revealed themselves to the world. And as we know, things got a lot worse when the cons went on to sink the USS Theodore Roosevelt and all the lives on it. Because of this attack, the government declared war on the Decepticons, and the Obama administration, believing that the Autobots were partly responsible, deactivated Nest and made preparations to exile the Autobots from the planet. However, this plan did not get any further since Lennox would go on to defy orders and take his Nest team on an unauthorized mission into Egypt, which ultimately saved the day. Because of this mission, the government would go on to learn that the Decepticons' continued presence on Earth was not because they wanted to seek vengeance upon the Autobots, but to activate a star harvester, a device which could convert the energy of stars into energon, and thus they dropped their plans to exile the bots and allowed them to stay. Later on in Dark of the Moon, with the Decepticons now in hiding, the administration would use the Autobots to search for signs of another Decepticon attack, and to police human affairs by spreading some good old freedom around the world. The point that I'm getting at here is that the administration was very hands-on when it came to the Autobots because they were directly tied to the nation's national security. And you can only imagine the level of monitoring the administration did after the Battle of Chicago. This is why Attinger could not just go on his crusade right away, because the Obama administration was constantly looking over his shoulder. And so Attinger would only be able to make his move if the next administration that came into power at the start of 2017 was less hands-on. Now, the second piece of evidence that I have that supports the Autobots working with Cemetery Wind is the fact that Cemetery Wind needed the Autobots in order to take out the Decepticons. You see, the Battle of Chicago made it clear to Attinger that humans for the most part were not capable of killing Decepticons without the Autobots' help. And we know that he knew this since the Battle of Chicago showed the world that the greatest military on Earth was not able to stop the Decepticons until the Autobots came back to save the day. So if the military couldn't do it, a Black Ops task force wouldn't stand a chance. Now, I can already hear some of you guys saying, wait, didn't Ratchet get killed by Cemetery Wind? And, well, no, not really. You see, though they were able to damage him, they were far from actually killing him. You see, the only reason why they were able to immobilize him here was thanks to Lockdown. Because Lockdown was responsible for sniping Ratchet's leg off, preventing him from escaping, crippling his armor which made Ratchet weaker, and taking out his blaster which prevented Ratchet from fighting back. And we know that Lockdown was responsible for all this and not Cemetery Wind, because we can clearly see Lockdown's iconic silver missile in each of the shots. So based on this, if Cemetery Wind was having this hard of a time with Ratchet, who is more of a medic than a soldier, and who held back from actually shooting the humans and instead just shot around them in order to knock them back just like Optimus Prime would go on to do, you can only imagine how much Cemetery Wind would struggle against a semi-competent Decepticon goon who had no regard for human life. So with that said, Cemetery Wind needed the Autobots if they wanted a fighting chance against the Decepticons. And after all, the Decepticons would be Cemetery Wind's main target in this crusade, since they were the ones who directly killed civilians while the Autobots indirectly caused their deaths. Now, the third and final piece of evidence that I have that can prove that the Autobots previously worked with Cemetery Wind comes from the dialogue spoken by Ratchet during his death scene. As we know, Ratchet went into hiding because he was sent this distress message from Optimus Prime.
Calling all Autobots. We are under targeted attack. Cease all contact with humans.
Given this context, you would assume that Ratchet would have perceived the humans that were actively trying to kill him as the very individuals Prime warned the Autobots about. However, he doesn't, and instead when Cemetery Wind boxes him in, Ratchet proceeds to introduce himself, stating that he is their friend and an Autobot.
Medical Officer Ratchet. I'm a friend. I'm an Autobot.
But the smoking gun here is that when James Salvoy asks Ratchet why he was running from them if he was in fact an Autobot, Ratchet plays Prime's distress message to them, and goes on to tell them this.
We're all hiding. All Autobots are being hunted. We're all in danger.
As you can see, Ratchet was clueless that Cemetery Wind were the ones hunting down the Autobots. The fact that he introduces himself as a friend and an Autobot when confronted, and even plays Prime's distress message as proof of his identity, shows that he genuinely believed that the Cemetery Wind soldiers were not the individuals Prime had cautioned the Autobots about. And the only logical reason that can explain this is that there was a prior relationship between the Autobots and Cemetery Wind. Now you might be saying that even if there was a prior relationship between them, why would Ratchet justify Cemetery Wind trying to kill him? And well, if you think about it, after the Autobots got that distress message, they would go on to sever all contact with humanity, and subsequently ghost Cemetery Wind. It's not too far-fetched to say that Ratchet might have thought that Cemetery Wind had mistaken him as a Decepticon, thus explaining why he would go on to profusely prove his identity to them. However, once they resumed their fire on him, that's when he knew something was terribly wrong. It was in that moment of betrayal that he realized Cemetery Wind was not what he initially thought, forcing him to fight back in order to save his life. So with all that said, I think that there is enough evidence here to prove that the Autobots and Cemetery Wind worked with each other shortly after the Battle of Chicago in order to hunt down the remaining Decepticons. And during the events of Age of Extinction, we would go on to learn that fewer than a dozen Decepticons were left thanks to Cemetery Wind's efforts. Now, something that you might be wondering, and something that I have been wondering myself ever since this film came out, is who exactly are the remaining Decepticons? Unfortunately, Attinger does not provide any further details about their identities, and the only thing that we know is that the number of Decepticons left on Earth is less than 12, which could mean anywhere from 1 to 11 Decepticons were on Earth during 2018. So then, who are they? And well, the only one that we know about officially is Barricade, since despite him appearing to be killed by Nesta during the Battle of Chicago, we would later see him appear alive and well during Transformers The Last Night. Now, as for the potential 10 other Decepticons, officially they are a complete mystery to us. However, I have done several theories on this channel in the past, talking about the fates and backstories of various Decepticon characters, and pulling from those theories we can get a better idea of who the other Decepticons are. Based on my The Origins of Onslaught, Mohawk, Dreadbot, and Berserker theory, we know that Onslaught, Dreadbot, and Berserker were some of the Decepticons that Attinger was likely referring to. And based on my Constructicon Misconceptions 2.0 video, I theorized that the Decepticons Payload and Scrapper switched sides to the Autobots during the events between Dark of the Moon and Age of Extinction, becoming Canopy and Trench respectively, thus adding more cons to the list and bringing our known Decepticon count to half a dozen. As for who the other 5 could potentially be is unfortunately still a mystery to us, but I plan to do a video in the future attempting to solve who these 5 remaining Decepticons might be. Now, something that you might be wondering is if Cemetery Wind only focused on the remaining Decepticons in the United States, or also the ones that were all around the globe. And well, the film doesn't really give us a direct answer to this. However, since Cemetery Wind would go on to set a trap and ambush Optimus Prime in Mexico City, it seems likely that just like Nesta, they were allowed into foreign territory, and thus were able to hunt Decepticons all around the globe. And speaking of Nest, it appears that the government would actually give Cemetery Wind some of their equipment, since in this shot we can clearly see one of Nest's iconic 2008 Hummer HX GMT 345s. However, it looks like Cemetery Wind would remove the equipment on top of it. So with all that information squared off, I think it's now time for me to answer the question that you all have been waiting for. That question being, when did Cemetery Wind transition from working with the Autobots to actively hunting them down? And well, several key events had to play out in order for Attinger Attinger to pull off his diabolical plan. The first one being the change of presidential administration. As we know, the Obama administration had a high level of oversight and involvement in monitoring the Autobots and their activities. This close scrutiny made it virtually impossible for Attinger to launch his campaign against the Autobots, since the administration was actively peering over his shoulder. However, this apparent setback would ultimately work in Attinger's favor. By adhering to the government's directives and operating within the bounds of official government oversight, Attinger was able to maintain a positive reputation for effectively managing the ongoing conflict, thus solidifying his trust and credibility within the government. And so, when the next presidential administration, which goes unnamed in Age of Extinction, came into power during 2017, the watchful eye of the Obama administration was no more, thus marking a critical turning point for Attinger, since with the Obama administration out of the way, he would now be able to pursue his vendetta against the Autobots, only if the new administration was less hands-on than its predecessor. And fortunately for him, they were. And we know this since in Age of Extinction, the White House dispatched the Chief of Staff to the CIA headquarters. The purpose was for the Chief of Staff to set up a meeting between the President, Attinger, and the CIA Director, since the Commander-in-Chief was interested in learning about the specifics on how the CIA was conducting its operations against the Decepticons. Now, you might be wondering, how does this prove that this new administration was less hands-on? Well, the fact that this new administration, after roughly being in power for 1 year and 4 months, still did not possess detailed knowledge about the CIA's approach to the war essentially speaks for itself. Now, you might be wondering why this administration was so hands-off. And well, it's worth considering a few factors. Firstly, this administration assumed power 4 years after the Battle of Chicago, and during that time, Transformer attacks seemed to be non-existent. Additionally, it's quite likely that they were briefed by the outgoing Obama administration about the CIA's effective management of the war. What this suggests is that things were gradually returning to a sense of normalcy for the country, and the new administration was likely focused on maintaining that stability over prioritizing direct involvement in Transformer-related affairs, since the CIA was handling that. On top of this, it's safe to say that Attinger likely played a hand in them being distant, by strategically shaping the narrative of the war in his favor by feeding the administration lies. And we actually have evidence of his willingness to deceive the government, since during the events of Age of Extinction, he actually does lie to the government. You see, after Optimus Prime got away from Cemetery Wind for a second time, Attinger became concerned that Cade Yeager would expose their operation to the government. And so, to cover his tracks, he fabricated a story claiming that Cemetery Wind was pursuing a Decepticon target, and that a civilian named Cade Yeager and his family were involved. He then told the government that if the Yeager family went to the authorities, they needed to send them straight over to the CIA.
Washington thinks we were chasing the Decepticon target, but our story falls apart if we don't find this Yeager family first.
Yeah, well, what if he goes to the cops or the FBI?
They know to hand him over. His world as he knows it is gone.
Now, another thing I would like to mention is that it's highly likely that top-ranking officials in the CIA were also feeding lies to the administration as well, when it came to what was actually going on with the war and their relationship with the Autobots. Now, you might be wondering, wait, wasn't this whole operation solely on Attinger? And well, this is a common misconception, since though Attinger was the mastermind, other high-ranking officials in the CIA were also in on his plan. And we know this since at the start of the movie, we saw Attinger addressing a CIA committee, outlining Cemetery Wind's progress and emphasizing their ongoing mission for America to secure and maintain control over all Cybertronian technology. Furthermore, we know that the director of the CIA, who was appointed by the Obama administration 2 years prior to the events of Age of Extinction, knew exactly what Attinger was up to.
We get maybe some more specifics about how exactly you're hunting the enemy Decepticons left.
I've had my desk for 2 years. Mr. Attinger has been here for 25. He runs the projects where I don't ask for specifics. That's why they're called Black Ops, and why we all sleep better at night.
So as you can see, this conspiracy ran deep within the upper echelons of the CIA, and thus this coordinated effort among these officials made it relatively easy for the CIA to cover up what they were exactly doing to the Autobots. So with all that said, this can explain why during the events of Age of Extinction, the White House believed that Attinger and his unit were working with the bots.
The president would, I know, just love, really love to press the flesh, not flesh, obviously, but just maybe get a shot with, is it Lord Prime? Sir Prime? Did we get a bop on Air Force One? It'd be just a quick bop. We just bop and then bop back.
Wouldn't get his hopes up on that one.
So with the White House completely clueless as to what the CIA was doing, Attinger would finally be able to pursue his vendetta against the Autobots. However, there was one massive problem. If Cemetery Wind needed the Autobots in order to kill the Decepticons, who was he going to use to kill the Autobots? And well, this is where Lockdown comes into play. As we know in Age of Extinction, Lockdown was a key asset for Cemetery Wind, since they were able to use him to hunt down and pick off the Autobots. However, the film never explains to us how Attinger got in contact with Lockdown, and subsequently had that three-way deal. The origins of how this deal came to be is a question that us fans have been wondering ever since the film came out almost a decade ago. And I think that I have a solid theory that can finally provide closure to this question. If you guys watched my How Lockdown Came to Earth video, you would know that I theorized that the energy wave that was created due to Cybertron collapsing in on itself traveled throughout the far reaches of space and caught Lockdown's attention. After picking up an energon reading from it, he would trace it all the way back to a planet unknown to him called Earth. Now, in this theory, I also theorized that Lockdown made planetfall in early 2016. However, when I came up with that theory over a year ago now, I forgot to take into account the presidential administrations. And since the Obama administration was still in power during 2016, there was no feasible way for Attinger to team up with Lockdown and hunt down the Autobots. Therefore, this early 2016 planetfall date is inaccurate. So then, when did Lockdown come to Earth and join forces with Cemetery Wind? And well, would you believe me if I told you that it was only a few weeks before the events of Age of Extinction? Yeah, I know that sounds crazy, but I assure you that this is likely the case. As we know, the first time Cemetery Wind and Lockdown teamed up was when they ambushed Optimus Prime in Mexico City, and when Prime ultimately escaped, Cemetery Wind and Lockdown hunted down any other Autobot that they could find, in the hopes of extracting Optimus Prime's whereabouts from them. So if we can figure out when Cemetery Wind ambushed Optimus Prime in Mexico City, we will know roughly when Lockdown made planetfall and subsequently teamed up with Cemetery Wind. And luckily for us, the film gives us this very interesting piece of information.
So what happened in Mexico City? Thought you had him.
3 direct hits, a mortal wound. Then your men allowed him to escape.
Now, you might be wondering, how does this scene tell us when the Mexico City ambush happened? And well, if we break it down, Attinger flew all the way to the Arctic to have a meeting with Lockdown, questioning him on why he wasn't able to capture Optimus Prime. Prime's escape is phrased here as an event that happened fairly recently, and though we don't know how long ago it happened before this scene, it's safe to assume that Attinger wouldn't have waited too long after their failed operation to set up this meeting with Lockdown, especially given that he was going behind the back of the President of the United States. So if we take this all into consideration, realistically the ambush on Optimus Prime likely happened no more than 2 weeks before the events of Age of Extinction, meaning Lockdown likely made planetfall at least a week before the ambush. And this time frame will be important when I go on to discuss how many Autobots Cemetery Wind was able to hunt down. So now knowing when Lockdown roughly came to Earth, we now need to figure out how he got in contact with Attinger. And unfortunately for us, the film doesn't give us any direct information on this. The only thing that we know is that Lockdown made a deal with Attinger. That deal was for Attinger to use his Cemetery Wind unit to assist Lockdown with the safe apprehension of Optimus Prime, and in return for Prime, Lockdown would hand over the seed to Attinger.
A deal is done. 1 Prime for 1 seed.
And as we know, Attinger would turn this 2-way deal into a 3-way deal, since he would hand over the seed to Joshua Joyce, the founder of KSI, in order to resolve the Transformium crisis plaguing his company. In exchange for the seed, Joyce would give Attinger 5 million shares of his company, allowing Attinger to retire from the CIA and become Joyce's business partner.
You came to me on this, remember? You retire from the CIA, you get a 7-figure piece of my company, and you and I revolutionize national defense together.
So with all that said, we need to figure out how Lockdown got in contact with Attinger, and find out why he decided to give him the seed in exchange for Optimus. And well, luckily for us, I have a pretty good theory that can explain these two questions. I theorize that once Lockdown traveled to our Blue Marble in the hopes of capturing Optimus Prime, he would go on to scan the World Wide Web for information about Optimus, learning about the Autobots' previous relationship with the military, and how the Battle of Chicago turned the majority of public opinion against them. However, Lockdown's discoveries didn't stop there. He would have also come across information about Kinetic Solutions Incorporated, a defense contractor entrusted by the United States government with a unique contract. That contract allowed KSI to salvage the remains of the deceased Transformers in order for them to reverse engineer their technology so it could be turned into weapons for the United States military. And so, recognizing that the majority of the world turned their backs on the Autobots, with a growing desire to replace them with their own artificially created counterparts, Lockdown saw a strategic opportunity. He realized that he could exploit this prevailing anti-Transformer sentiment to his advantage, and understood that whoever was responsible for safeguarding the Autobots might be persuaded into collaborating with him, especially if he enticed them with an offer that aligned with global sentiment. Continuing his investigation, Lockdown soon discovered the existence of the CIA Black Ops unit Cemetery Wind, and learned that it was under the leadership of a man named Harold Attinger. He would go on to discover that Cemetery Wind had been working with the Autobots for a handful of years to take out the remaining Decepticon forces left on the planet. And so, knowing that Attinger was in charge, Lockdown would go on to get in contact with him. As for how exactly he went about contacting Attinger is anyone's guess. However, he might have simply just left a message on his phone. And if you think this sounds a little silly, take into account that Drift was able to discover Joshua Joyce's phone number after intercepting a transmission, and Sentinel Prime was able to send an encrypted audio file of his voice to the United Nations. So with that said, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Lockdown discovered Attinger's number, and left him a message outlining his intentions and offering the seed in exchange for Optimus Prime. And as we know, Attinger would accept this offer, and even went so far as to promise Lockdown that he would provide him with human intelligence.
You promised me human intelligence. Or is there such a thing?
Now, you might be wondering why Lockdown offered the seed to Attinger. And well, I theorize that when Lockdown was researching KSI, he discovered that the company was facing a crisis, that being a severe shortage of transformium. If left unresolved, this crisis would easily lead to the downfall of the company. And so, realizing the potential fortune that could be gained by resolving KSI's transformium crisis, Lockdown decided to offer the seed to Attinger. And in doing so, he essentially provided Attinger with a powerful bargaining chip that he could bring to KSI. As we know, the film tells us that the seed had enough transformium in it to last KSI 100 years. This in turn would end the crisis KSI was having, making Attinger an indispensable figure in the eyes of the company. This in turn would enable Attinger to negotiate a pretty penny from Joshua Joyce, ultimately making him a multi-millionaire. So with us now understanding how Lockdown and Attinger formed an alliance, it's now finally time to piece together what happened leading up to and during the events of Mexico City. One of the first significant developments during this time was that Attinger got in contact with Joshua Joyce, presenting him with the opportunity to secure the seed, highlighting its potential to end the transformium shortage and catapult KSI into a dominant position in the global arms market. Joyce, having a keen eye for business opportunities, recognized the immense value of this proposition and agreed to give 5 million shares of his company in exchange for the seed. However, this wouldn't be the only thing Joyce would do, since recognizing the significance of Optimus Prime's capture in their plan, Joyce decided to leverage KSI's technological capabilities and directed his company to produce mini spy drones, specifically designed to assist Cemetery Wind. Lockdown would also help Cemetery Wind prepare by giving Attinger and likely the other Cemetery Wind soldiers some sort of device that they could use to communicate with him.
Where is my escaped bounty?
Autobots at this location.
And with all that squared off, we now finally get to discuss what we've all been waiting for, the events of Mexico City. Now, unfortunately, the film never shows us what happened in Mexico City, besides this photo of Optimus Prime leaving the area. However, the film does give us a handful of information that we can use to piece together what the heck happened. As we know in the film, Optimus Prime tells Cade and company that he was ambushed and trapped by humans, and made sure to elaborate that they were not the only ones attacking him. He also tells us that he was able to escape, and in doing so, took the form of a Marmon HDT AC-86.
What happened to you?
An ambush, a trap, set by humans. I escaped and took this form.
But you're on our side. Why would humans hurt you?
They were not alone.
We also know that Prime would send out his distress message after escaping and travel to Paris, Texas, where he would go into stasis in an abandoned movie theater. Furthermore, thanks to Lockdown, we know that he shot Optimus 3 times and inflicted a mortal wound. That, of course, would be the missile that he lodged in Optimus.
A missile hit your engine, and we took it out of you. Took a hell of a hit, you know. The missile just missed your power source.
We call it a spark.
And even with all that damage, Cemetery Wind wasn't able to immobilize him, allowing Prime to escape. Now, this is all the information that the film tells us about what went down in Mexico City. However, this information just spawns way more questions than answers, such as how did Cemetery Wind trick Prime into going to Mexico City? Why did Optimus Prime not directly mention Cemetery Wind and Lockdown in his distress message? And how did Optimus end up in that movie theater? Well, let's try to piece together what exactly happened to Optimus Prime using all the information that we have, and attempt to answer all these questions and more along the way. A good place to start is to figure out why Cemetery Wind chose to ambush Prime in Mexico City. And well, I theorize that Cemetery Wind strategically chose Mexico City for the ambush because they were keenly aware that if they were going to take on the leader of the Autobots, they couldn't afford to have him call in reinforcements. By staging the ambush in Mexico City, they positioned themselves in a location removed from potential Autobot support. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that we don't exactly know where Cemetery Wind based the Autobots. However, since the CIA headquarters is located in Virginia, it's safe to say that the Autobots were based somewhere close to it. And if we take a look at a map, we can see that Mexico City is roughly 40 hours away from the CIA's headquarters. This substantial distance would have made it impossible for Optimus Prime to call in reinforcements. This in turn would make the Autobot leader isolated and cut off from any potential assistance, increasing the odds of Cemetery Wind successfully ambushing him, allowing Lockdown to capture him without the worry of the Autobots trying to save their leader. Now, something you might be wondering is how do we know that Optimus Prime was alone? And well, we know that he was since when the events of Mexico City are brought up, no other Autobot besides Optimus Prime is mentioned. And if an Autobot was with Prime, he would have definitely mentioned them. Now, you could say, what about Sam Witwicky? And for those of you who are scratching your heads right now, allow me to explain. You see, ever since this movie came out, many fans have come to believe that Sam Witwicky was with Optimus Prime during the ambush, and was killed by Cemetery Wind. The reason why many fans believe this is because during this scene, they believe that they heard Optimus Prime say, "Sam, run."
Sam, run.
However, as you guys can clearly hear, Optimus is grunting and not actually saying "Sam, run." So with that said, no other Autobot or Sam Witwicky was with Optimus Prime when he was ambushed. So now knowing why Cemetery Wind chose Mexico City, we now need to figure out how they were able to ambush Optimus there, and at the same time we also need to figure out why Optimus didn't realize that Cemetery Wind and Lockdown were the ones ambushing him. Now you might be wondering, wait, Optimus didn't know that he was being ambushed by Cemetery Wind and Lockdown? And yeah, we know that Prime did not know because when he made his distress message, he said nothing about Lockdown or Cemetery Wind.
Calling all Autobots. We are under targeted attack. Cease all contact with humans.
Furthermore, during the scene when he was explaining what happened to him, Prime doesn't mention anything about Cemetery Wind or Lockdown, and instead says that humans ambushed him and that they were not alone.
An ambush, a trap, set by humans. They were not alone.
This shows that during the events of Age of Extinction, Optimus was still clueless that Cemetery Wind was behind his ambush, but came to realize that whatever humans were hunting him down must have gotten help from a Cybertronian. As for how Optimus came to this realization, this can easily be explained away by the fact that Optimus has been fighting a war with the Decepticons for millions of years, and over that course of time it's safe to say that he got shot many times, and thus he would know what Cybertronian ammunition would feel like compared to human ammunition. So with all that said, I hope that this proves to you that during the ambush, Optimus was clueless that Cemetery Wind was the ones behind it, and that Lockdown was the one helping them. And well, with all that squared off, let's circle back to the original question of how Cemetery Wind was able to ambush Optimus Prime. And since there's no information on how they exactly did it, here's my best guess based on all the information that we have. After carefully selecting Mexico City as the ideal location to isolate Optimus Prime from the rest of the Autobots, Attinger briefed his soldiers and shared the details with Lockdown. However, Attinger understood the critical importance of ensuring that Optimus Prime remained oblivious to their involvement in the ambush, even if it ultimately failed, since revealing their role would risk alerting not only Prime, but also the other Autobots to their actions, and thus could lead to a unified and potentially overwhelming response from the Autobots. And so, determined to ambush Optimus Prime while keeping Cemetery Wind's involvement a secret, James Salvoy fabricated a story about a Decepticon being spotted in Mexico City, and convinced Optimus Prime that his presence was urgently needed. This ruse served as the perfect bait. drawing Prime to the chosen ambush location without raising his suspicions. To maintain a low profile and to minimize their direct involvement, Attinger had Salvoy and a select group of soldiers airdrop Optimus Prime into Mexico City. They assured Prime that they would swiftly retrieve him once the mission was completed. As Optimus descended from the sky, Cemetery Wind soldiers stripped of all insignias linking them to the organization remained concealed near the drop point, ready to strike as soon as Prime approached their carefully laid trap. Their trap in question was a lifeless Decepticon protoform, strategically positioned to capture Prime's attention upon his arrival. As Prime landed, he looked around and noticed the body. Believing it to be a genuine threat, he approached it and meticulously examined it, surprised to see that it was already dead. Unbeknownst to him, Cemetery Wind forces were rapidly unfolding around him. Meanwhile, high above, concealed within the shadows, Lockdown observed the soldiers as they slowly closed in on Optimus, patiently awaiting the perfect moment to strike. As they closed in on the Autobot leader, the tension in the air reached a breaking point and the soldiers opened fire on Prime. The Autobot leader, confused by the sudden onslaught, instinctively raised his hands to shield himself from the gunfire. After realizing that his attackers were humans, he quickly attempted to communicate his identity as an Autobot and pleaded for a peaceful resolution. However, the Cemetery Wind soldiers continued their relentless assault. From his vantage point high above, Lockdown watched the unfolding chaos. With impeccable timing, he fired his first shot, hitting Optimus Prime in the shoulder, causing parts of his armor to fly off. Prime stumbled back in pain, and in an effort to deter his attackers, Optimus drew out his ion blasters and fired warning shots. However, Lockdown fired again, this time hitting Prime in the side, forcing him to drop his weapons. With Prime disarmed, the soldiers persisted in their assault. Knowing that the only way to win this battle was to use lethal force, Optimus attempted to flee, putting some distance between himself and the soldiers. However, Lockdown fired another shot, striking Prime in the back. The impact sent Prime crashing to the ground, his systems damaged but not defeated. In the distance, Optimus Prime spotted an abandoned cab-over truck and scanned it, adopting it as his new vehicle form in order to throw off his attackers. With a surge of determination, he accelerated away from the ambush site. As the soldiers continued to fire at him, Lockdown managed to deliver one final hit that went through Prime's grill and slammed into his engine, nearly missing a spark. Luckily for Prime, the missile did not explode, but the damage was done, and if he didn't get fixed sometime soon, he would succumb to his injuries. As Optimus Prime raced towards the United States, the agony of his injuries bore down on him with each passing mile. Prime would urgently send out a distress message to the Autobots, warning them that they were under targeted attack, and that they needed to cease all contact with humans. Despite his unwavering spirit, the possibility of reaching Virginia seemed to slip away with each passing turn. Paris, Texas finally came into view, but the 22-hour drive had drained his strength to its limits. His hope flickered like a dying ember. Then, as if guided by fate, he spotted an abandoned movie theater. Recognizing it as his only sanctuary, he entered the decaying building. Inside, he initiated stasis lock, allowing himself to finally rest. So yeah, that's basically what I think happened. Now, something you might be wondering is why Optimus didn't get in contact with Cemetery Wind after he was ambushed. And well, my explanation would be that Optimus had a hunch that the humans that ambushed him might have been Cemetery Wind, based on their military training and the weapons they used. But since he didn't know for sure, he couldn't pinpoint them as the culprit, which can explain why he told the Autobots to outright cease all contact with humans, since any human could potentially be dangerous. And this can explain why he acted so fearful when he saw Cade, Tessa, and Lucas for the first time. Something you might have picked up on when listening to my sequence of events is that I described Lockdown as sniping Optimus from the shadows, and I did this because it plays right into his character. Since when Cemetery Wind was attacking Ratchet, Lockdown deliberately chose to attack from the shadows until he wanted to make his presence known. And since Prime wasn't able to see Lockdown, he couldn't confirm for sure if his attackers had Cybertronian help, which would explain why he didn't mention anything about it in his distress message. And so, with Mexico City squared off, we now need to take a look at what the Autobots did after getting this distress message. And well, thanks to Drift, we know that after Optimus Prime went missing, Bumblebee took command of the Autobots, but Drift wasn't too thrilled about it. Another thing that we know is that the Autobots would end up traveling to Monument Valley, and we can figure that this was an order made by Bumblebee. Now, you might be wondering why B would want to send everyone there. Well, as we know, he got the order to cease all contact with humans. And so, what better place to have the Autobots lay low and avoid human contact than a literal desert? However, a formidable challenge laid before them. The daunting journey to Monument Valley spanned over 30 hours from their current location, and so one might assume that in the face of a targeted attack and the sheer distance of their destination, they would have resorted to splitting up since they could cover more ground and potentially reach their destination faster. This would also reduce their visibility as a group, making it harder for their attackers to track their movements. Now, this assumption provides a flawless rationale as to why the Autobots would split up, and it can explain why the Autobots were separated during the events of Age of Extinction. However, there's just one teeny weeny little problem. That problem, of course, is the Cemetery Wind kill cards. You see, in Harold Attinger's opening scene, we see him holding this deck of cards, featuring the mugshots of various Autobots and Decepticons. Though it's never stated when this deck was created, we do know that it had to be made sometime after the ambush in Mexico City, since Optimus Prime's card says Last Seen Mexico City on it. And if we take a look at the various Autobot cards, on every single one of them it says Last Seen Chicago. This means that sometime after the ambush in Mexico City, all the Autobots were spotted in Chicago by Cemetery Wind, and I'll get into how they found them in a bit. However, the question now is, why would Bumblebee take the bots to Chicago? Chicago was literally the reason why the world turned against them. Furthermore, thanks to Age of Extinction and The Last Night, we know that the military and the Department of Homeland Security were actively watching over the city, meaning that it would be extremely difficult for any person, let alone 10 Transformers, to get in. So why would Bumblebee risk taking his team into Ground Zero? Well, here's my theory. As we know, after Optimus Prime sent out his distress message, he mysteriously went MIA. Bumblebee knew that whatever threat had targeted their leader now had its sights on the entire Autobot team. And if the leader of the Autobots could be potentially taken out by this mysterious adversary, B knew that the rest of the Autobots stood a little chance on their own. The urgency of their situation demanded unity. Separating from one another could leave them isolated and vulnerable to being hunted down individually. Thus, the decision to stay together was not just a strategic one, but a matter of survival. Bumblebee knew that Monument Valley was their ideal destination for laying low and avoiding human contact. However, the journey there posed a formidable challenge, spanning over 30 hours from their current location. It wasn't a trip that they could make easily, especially with the persistent threat that pursued them. But Bumblebee's strategy wasn't just about reaching Monument Valley, it was about finding a means to get there safely. And as we know, after the Battle of Chicago, many Decepticon ships remained within the city's confines. I theorized that Bumblebee might have reasoned that if the Autobots could salvage a handful of these ships, which they were totally capable of doing since the Wreckers built the Xanthium, they would have the capability to fly to Monument Valley, eliminating the risk of being hunted down on the ground. Nevertheless, while the plan held promise, it was undoubtedly risky. Bumblebee understood that the very adversary who had hunted down Optimus Prime was bound to be hot on their trail as well. The urgency of their situation left little time for hesitation. Prioritizing the safety of his team above all else, Bumblebee made the calculated decision to lead the Autobots to Chicago. And yeah, that's my theory as to why all the Autobots were in Chicago. So then, now the question is, how did Cemetery Wind spot them and subsequently hunt them down? And well, there's many ways that they could have been spotted. For instance, an energon detector could have been triggered, or a civilian recognizing a familiar yellow and black Camaro decided to report in some suspicious alien activity. Bottom line, the Autobots got their cover blown one way or another, and Cemetery Wind was now in pursuit. I theorized that they took refuge in a part of Chicago that was still abandoned, and we know that this is entirely plausible since during the events of Transformers The Last Night, which takes place no later than 2022, there are still large parts of Chicago that are still abandoned. But now the question is, how did Cemetery Wind go about ambushing the Autobots? And well, there is multiple ways that this could have went down with the limited information that we have. But we do know that the Autobots didn't realize Cemetery Wind were the ones behind it, based on the fact that Ratchet didn't think that Cemetery Wind were the ones hunting them down. And we also know that the Autobots didn't know that Lockdown was involved, since Ratchet was shocked to see him.
Lockdown.
So with all that said, this is how I believe the ambush roughly went down. Once Cemetery Wind was tipped off by an energon detector that multiple Cybertronians were in one of the abandoned parts of Chicago, they notified Lockdown and made their way to the location. After using their mini-drones to figure out where the Autobots were at, they realized that their ground forces would be overpowered if they tried to attack them, and so they sent their choppers to weed them out in the hopes that they would separate. Knowing that being all grouped up would make them an easier target, Bumblebee ordered everyone to split up and regroup at Monument Valley. This would force their attackers to divide their attention and resources. While escaping, Bumblebee would scan a 1967 Chevrolet Camaro and speed off to safety. However, Leadfoot wasn't as lucky, and Cemetery Wind would focus all their efforts on him. While being chased by their SUVs, Leadfoot would fire back at them in his vehicle mode. However, he would be cut off and surrounded, forcing him to transform. Realizing that his attackers were Cemetery Wind, he would attempt to plead with them, telling his former allies that he was an Autobot.
No! An Autobot! I'm an Autobot!
However, as we know, Cemetery Wind ignored his pleas, and Lockdown subsequently killed him. KSI cleanup crews would shortly show up on site to collect Leadfoot's body in order to melt him down into transformium. So yeah, that's basically how I believe the ambush went down. I feel like all of this neatly explains how all the Autobots were last seen in Chicago, despite them all being separated based on what we saw in Age of Extinction. And I think that Bumblebee's failed attempt at getting the Autobots to Monument Valley can serve as the explanation as to why Drift and Crosshairs didn't respect Bumblebee as a leader.
Bumblebee has held command, despite his complete and total lack of anything resembling warrior discipline. He's like a child.
This child is about to kick your ass.
He brings us shame.
Okay, that's what you get for taking the yellow bugger. You need a leader out there, like me.
Shut up! Before I do some damage, you won't walk away from me.
You will never be Optimus Prime.
So now the question is, how many more Autobots besides Ratchet and Leadfoot were taken out by Cemetery Wind before the events of Age of Extinction? And well, according to Drift, he tells us that himself, Hound, Crosshairs, Bumblebee, and Optimus Prime were all that were left.
So there's been no sign of any others? None.
We are all that's left.
They're picking us off one by one.
We're the pathetic, dirty foursome. And you make 5.
However, we know that this is not true, since in Transformers The Last Night, we see Topspin hanging out with Seymour Simmons in Cuba, and as you can see, he's sporting Leadfoot's head, which deserves an entire explanation video on its own. But the answer that us fans have come up with is that he changed the way his head looks in order to honor Leadfoot. So if Topspin was able to survive, this means that Drift was wrong about the other Autobots being dead. Now you might be wondering why he believed this, and well, considering that no other Autobot made it to Monument Valley with them, despite them waiting there for some time, it makes sense why he believed that the rest of the bots were dead. Now, something interesting here is that based on the dialogue in this scene, the Autobots still do not know that Cemetery Wind were the ones hunting them down, since Crosshairs and Hound don't directly mention Cemetery Wind. However, the bots do know that they are being picked off one by one, and you might think that this is because they witnessed Leadfoot being killed. However, this is not the case, since his death comes as a surprise to the Autobots.
Oh, that's Leadfoot.
So then, how do they know this? Well, I chalk it up to the fact that since only a handful of them made it to Monument Valley after the ambush in Chicago, they all came to the conclusion that everyone else was taken out after they separated. However, as we know, they were wrong, since Topspin was able to survive. So if he was able to make it out, this means that some other Autobots must have been able to escape as well. And if you guys watched my video breaking down the Cemetery Wind kill cards, we know that Sideswipe, Mirage, and Roadbuster all made it out alive, meaning that the only Autobots that Cemetery Wind was able to kill were Leadfoot and Ratchet. And this realistically makes sense, since Cemetery Wind roughly had around 2 weeks to hunt down the Autobots before they would be tipped off about a truck matching Optimus Prime's description being present at the Jaeger property. Now, something really strange here is that Leadfoot's card is not listed as deceased, and in universe, these cards could have only been made after Leadfoot's death. Based on the Last Seen Chicago text, there's not really any great in-universe explanations that can fix this plot hole. But if you want something, we know that whoever made these cards in-universe must have rushed them out pretty quickly, since when creating the card for Garbage Bot, they typed Garage Bot instead. Furthermore, when creating Ironhide's card, they would put that he was last seen in Chicago, despite him being killed in Washington, D.C. And due to this rushing, they also forgot to add the X onto Leadfoot's card. This is the best in-universe theory that I have for this, but I would love to hear if you guys have anything better. Now, the very last thing that I would like to cover in order to catch us all the way up to speed with Age of Extinction is to explain how Cemetery Wind was able to find Ratchet. And well, after the ambush in Chicago, we know that Ratchet would make his way to Detroit. And we know this since during his death scene, we can see this crane that says Nicholson Terminal and Dock. And this crane is located at the Nicholson Terminal and Dock in Detroit, Michigan. So now knowing where Ratchet was at, the question now is how Cemetery Wind knew he was there. And well, if we look closely in this scene, we can see that the Cemetery Wind soldiers are not the only ones at this dock, since we can see several dock workers present. So with that said, I theorize that when Ratchet was making his way to Monument Valley, he drove past this shipyard. However, one of the dock workers, noticing that no ordinary emergency vehicle was lime green, recognized the strange vehicle as a Transformer from the Battle of Chicago, and would go on to call 855-363-8392 in order to report it. Sensing that he had been detected, Ratchet attempted to evade his pursuers by seeking refuge aboard one of the abandoned ships in the yard, concealing himself within one of its smokestacks. However, as we know, when Cemetery Wind showed up, their mini drones would go on to detect his heat signature, and the rest was history. And just like that, that's how the CIA was able to hunt down the Autobots. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video because it took a tremendous amount of time to make. This is by far the longest and most complicated project I have ever put together, and I really want to go all out for you guys because we literally just hit over 250,000 subscribers, and that number is just crazy. I can't even comprehend how a Bavers content creator could even get that high, and you know, I just really want to thank all of you guys for allowing me to do this for nearly 6 years. You know, this is my passion, and I was able to make it my job, and it's really all thanks to you guys. And I know that this video has been, you know, highly anticipated, probably since the start of this channel, actually, when I teased it. And I really hope it was worth the wait, guys. I truly tried to put in my all with this video, and I hope it really showed. So, once again, I want to thank all of you guys for over 250,000 subscribers. And I want to, you know, thank all of you guys for an amazing 6 years. And I can't wait to see what the next 6 years have in store for us. As always, everybody, keep on theorizing.